Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final review of the Zeiss Batis 18mm f2.8 lens. And so I've been spending the last several weeks doing a review of this lens and comparing it to the its kind of sister lens, the 25mm f2 from the Batis series as well. I've also done a few other comparisons just to kind of look at some things. For example, I still had on hand the Laowa 15mm f2 lens. Now, of course, this is a manual focus lens and it's a different focal length, but these are, I would say, your kind of best moderately sized, moderately light options for wide angle. And so I did do some optical comparisons between the two of them just to kind of see how they actually played out. So I would encourage you, first of all, if you haven't already, to take a look at this episode where I take a look at the build, the handling, and the design of the Batis 18mm, and that will give you more details about what you are getting for the money. And speaking of the money, it runs about $14.99 in the US market, and so at nearly $1,500, it's certainly not an inexpensive lens. But then again, I don't think that I ever sit here with a Zeiss lens in hand and say, this is an inexpensive lens. That's just not the nature of Zeiss lenses. And in this case, of course, you are getting a lot of lens for your money. The Batis series is a unique series for Sony FE, full frame mirrorless, that will allow you to have autofocus in a Zeiss lens. And I have to tell you that the very first lens that I reviewed was actually the Batis 135mm f2.8. I had to borrow a Sony body to do that review, and while at that time I wasn't really all that interested, this is during the period of the A7R Mark II, and I wasn't really all that intrigued in adding Sony to my kit at that point. I found, like, though I liked the image quality from the A7R Mark II, there was a number of shortcomings that I wasn't crazy about. But I always kind of envied Sony shooters' their ability to have autofocusing Zeiss lenses. And so when I began to get serious about getting an A7R Mark III, and after I reviewed it and found it to be a fantastic camera that improved most of the things that were wrong with the A7R Mark II, I immediately began to want to investigate the Batis line a little bit more thoroughly. And so with the Batis series, you are getting autofocus, and the autofocus is very good. The autofocus motor is quiet, it is accurate, it works well in all of the autofocus modes, including things like IAF. Though, as I noted in the 25mm f2 lens review, that with wide-angle lenses like this, IAF has more limited applications, or maybe I should say a more limited range in which you can use it, for the simple reason that with a wider focal length, the eye occupies an ever-increasingly smaller portion of the frame. So if you get very far away from your subject, it means that the actual eye itself is going to be almost too small for IAF technology to effectively sense. And so just note that, I mean, the good news is that you're less likely to miss focus anyway, because depth of field is increasingly large, but also just know that IAF, it works better with portrait length type lenses for that reason right there, that the eye is going to be more obvious at more focused distances. So IAF works fine here, but it has a limited application. Autofocus was accurate, it was quick. I ran into almost no hunting type situations, and so it does a great job with that. And as far as manual focus, this is a focus by wire lens. That means that the input into the manual focus ring, which is this rubberized ring here, it is routed through the camera body and then through the focus motor and the motor, and so you never actually focus the elements. You send input into the focus motor and it moves the elements. So it's a little bit different of a process, but fortunately, Zeiss has done a great job with the Batis series and kind of combating some of that. Number one, if you are sending input either in manual focus mode or DMF mode, and by the way, you're going to have to select those in camera. There are no switches anywhere on this lens. But it means that if you're in DMF mode, for example, and you don't like what autofocus has grabbed, you can start to put input in and immediately it will zoom in the image on either the LCD screen or in the viewfinder that will allow you to fine-tune focus more accurately. It really helps a lot. They've also done a great job with the weight of this lens, and even though there's no electronic or there's no manual coupling, you can turn this lens or this ring and it's not going to do anything unless you're inputting through the focus motor. But even though you're not directly affecting the movement, they've done a good job with the feel of the ring, where it's really pretty good. And the weight is about right, so it allows you to fine tune without lag issues. And so bottom line is that even though focus by wire is not my favorite manual focus method, Zeiss has done a good job of kind of mimicking a true manual focus experience, and it does a pretty good job. Helping that is an OLED screen, and that's unique to the Batis line at this point, as far as on Sony FE. And so what that focus screen does, or that OLED does, is that you can put different kinds of information to there, but the primary way you're probably going to use it is to replace a traditional distance window, in that it will actually show you information on where the camera is focused in terms of the distance. And in certain applications that certainly can be useful. For some people, the OLED is a gimmick. For others, it's certainly a useful thing. And where it might be a useful thing is if you are shooting video, for example, and you're looking down at that. Obviously, if you're looking through the viewfinder, this is going to do me, it's going to do basically as much good as an analog distance window would. You're not going to see it. But in other applications, you will be able to see it. And if you'll look in the description down below in my written review, I detail how you can actually activate a program mode on the lens, and you can tweak some of the information that is shown there. So you can find that link down in the description below. This is, obviously, it's not a small lens. It's actually, in terms of its physical dimensions, it is about 96% of the total volume of lens as the Milvus version for either Canon or Nikon DSLRs. But it because of the different approach that Zeiss has done in terms of the materials used, it is metal, but it's more lightweight in construction. This lens is less than half the weight of the Milvus version. And you can tell that most of the time you pick up a Zeiss lens, and it's kind of like this Laowa. It feels heavy for the size. It feels kind of uniquely dense. This Batis lens is kind of the opposite. It looks like it should be heavy, but it's actually only 300 grams. It's actually a very lightweight lens. As a result, it balances nicely on all the mirrorless bodies, Sony mirrorless bodies that you might mount it to. Most likely you're going to be putting this on an A7 series, a full frame. But, of course, you may also want to use it on an A6500 or A6300 or something like that, and it works fine there as well. You just have to apply the crop factor, and so in this case, it's going to become, instead of an 18mm lens, it's going to function more like a 27mm lens. So certainly still a very useful focal length, just different. Now, as far as the actual, by the way, this can be used with traditional screw-on filters, 77mm size, very common. It is a weather-sealed lens. It's got a gasket here. It's got internal sealing. And so it is ready to go for landscape applications. And most landscape applications, they happen outdoors where there is weather. Fortunately, this is moisture and dust sealed and ready to deal with that. Now, in terms of the image quality, I would encourage you to take a look at this episode here, where I break down the image quality and highlight some of the strengths and weaknesses of the Batis 18mm and how it compares to the 25mm f2. So, as I noted in the 25mm review, there are different strengths and weaknesses for these two lenses. They are both Distagon design, which is a classic Zeiss optical arrangement, but they do have, this is the more optically complex of the two, which, by the way, is always going to be the case. The wider you go, the more complex it is to actually engineer such a lens, because there are a lot of engineering challenges in wide-angle lenses. And so this lens is more complex by nature, but its incredible strength is that even at f2.8, if you're looking at the center 2/3 of the frame, it is what I would call basically perfect in terms of the sharpness and the contrast. It is brilliantly good. I mean, mind-blowingly good in the center of the frame. And it's incredible to zoom into wide-angle images, and of course to have a lot of pixels to work with on the 42 megapixel A7R Mark III, and to zoom into a pixel level so you go way into that image and the detail is just stunning. And so it is brilliant there. But where it is not as good as compared to the 25mm f2 is that it isn't quite as absolutely sharp at the very edges of the frame. The 25mm has a very even sharpness profile corner to corner. The 18mm, the corners, I don't know if they ever completely catch up with the middle. They improve, but they never get as perfect as what the middle does. Now, that being said, there's more of a variance if you're close to your subject than if you are further away from your subject. So at more traditional landscape apertures, you actually get pretty good edge performance. Now, it's not as good at close focus distances because there is some field curvature. There's a fair bit of distortion in this lens, and while it corrects well, note that even with the Sony bodies allow for in-camera corrections and so there is an embedded profile that'll even go into the raw images. But even with that applied, there's still a fairly obvious mustache distortion, which means that rather than it just be a single bulge, it's kind of a little bit of a up and down pattern there. And so those patterns tend to be a little bit more difficult to correct for. So as a result, if you're looking to shoot primarily architecture, maybe you're wanting to do real estate or interiors, this Laowa 15mm f2 is actually a better option because it has almost zero barrel distortion. Distortion is incredibly well corrected, and so it's actually a better option when it comes to that. The other thing that is left behind somewhat is some vignette, even after the in-camera profile is applied. Unfortunately, at least as it stands right now, as of the time of this review, the Adobe correction, either in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, it actually overcorrects for that vignette in that it over increases the edges of the frame to where it actually inputs too much correction, making them kind of appear a little bit white rather than natural. Chromatic aberrations are pretty much a non-issue. I found very, very little practical, real-world field chromatic aberrations. Not an issue. So neither of the lateral nor longitudinal type, just not really an issue. Flare resistance is good. It's not entirely perfect. You will find some minor ghosting artifacts, but neither did I find them overly large or overly destructive. And so for the most part, you're going to get really good results when you point this lens into the sun, and you never have an issue with loss of contrast. It holds up really well in that regard, not really any kind of veiling issues. And as I noted, that if you're shooting in the sweet spot of this lens, it is just incredibly, incredibly sharp. And so a lot of good that's going on for it there optically. Just note that there are also let me, if I could put it this way, its strengths in some ways are even more pronounced than what the 25mm f2 is, which is considered one of the very best wide-angle options for Sony, period. And so its strengths are incredible, but also its weaknesses are a little bit more obvious. The 25mm has weaknesses, but they're of such a mild variety, they're not likely to affect you. There will be some situations where the distortion might affect you on this lens, for example. And so just, kind of bear that into mind in going into purchase this lens. At the same time, this lens produces just stunning results. And I used it for shooting kind of traditional landscapes. I used it in Washington, D.C. On a trip in there. I even got to shoot at some in the White House, and the results that came out of it are brilliant. I mean, beautiful, beautiful. It's a great, great match to the A7R Mark III, and of course the fact that it's so lightweight, even though it's pretty fair size, makes it a beautiful match. That I carried it on a strap all day long walking in DC, and if you've ever done Washington DC, you know that you do a lot of walking. I think I did around 7 or 8 miles worth of walking that day, and so but I never really noticed the weight of it. I mean, it's great for that. The fact that it's weather sealed, of course, makes it useful for shooting in a wide variety of situations. And so, in conclusion, I would say that if you think you can handle the weaknesses of the lens, I think you're going to find it to be an amazing option if that 18mm focal length is what you're looking for. It has been noted by some that this may be one of the best vlogging lenses that are available for Sony full frame, in that it has great autofocus and it also has a great focal length. 18mm is a great vlogging focal length, and it's a very versatile focal length that I kind of consider right in the sweet spot for shooting landscapes. It's not so wide that composition becomes extreme, but neither is it so narrow that you can't get everything you want into the frame. And so it's a great focal length for that. It's a great lens. Just note that it's not cheap at $1,499, and and it does have a few potential challenges depending on your shooting style and what you want it for. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you will look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full written review, lots of sample images there. I've got an image gallery loaded with some great photos from it. You might want to take a look at that as well. And then, of course, you can find buying links if you would like to purchase one for yourself, or you can follow me there on social media, become a patron, sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.